It was September 1833, and behind the heavy oak doors of the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, the king was dying, not gently, not nobly, but in the most obscene and humiliating way a monarch could die, torn open from within by the very pleasures he had once ruled over like a god. Ferdinand VII of Spain, bloated with disease, lay splayed on his ceremonial bed, its crimson canopy, now a funeral shroud, suspended above his heaving body. The silks beneath him were soaked not with sweat, but with pus, blood, and the oozing rot of late-stage syphilis that had devoured his spine, his jaw, his genitals, and his mind. His eyes rolled white as his tongue lolled from his mouth, cracked like scorched earth, twitching with fragments of words he no longer recognized. Around him, the court physicians powdered, perfumed, and powerless, tried to hold back the stench with cloves burned in brass censers. One vomited quietly behind a curtain. Another pretended to check the pulse of a man whose body pulsed only with death. The ulcers on his chest had turned black, his groin eaten away. His mind hallucinated women, dozens of them crawling from the tapestries, their mouths full of ash, whispering in voices only he could hear. He screamed, "Forgive me, Madrecita, I didn't mean to break you." No one knew which wife he meant. He had outlived 4 of them. Some said they'd been poisoned. Others, that they had simply died of grief. All had married him young. All had died young. And none had dared speak of what they saw in his chambers after dark. The dying king tore at his own throat now, clawing at the rosary draped over his swollen chest, as if trying to strangle the priest who had once warned him that sin left marks not on the skin, but on the soul. And Ferdinand had sinned so deeply, so completely, that not even heaven wanted him now. No confessor dared remain alone with him. No servant would wipe his sores without gloves. No lover came to weep by his bed. Only death slow, hot, merciless kept him company. The room was sealed. Outside, the courtiers gossiped in hushed tones. "The king is being eaten alive," one whispered. "The whores cursed him," said another. "He fucked too many ghosts," muttered an old adviser, drunk on sherry and shame. The portraits on the walls, his ancestors in military regalia, their hands resting on swords and globes, seemed to glare down in judgment. But Ferdinand's gaze, what remained of it, flicked only to one object, the mirror opposite his bed, draped now in mourning cloth. He had ordered it covered weeks ago. He could no longer bear the sight of his own face yellowed, pocked, weeping with infection. The face of a king who had once believed himself a god. Now he soiled himself nightly. They wrapped his legs in linen to hide the disintegration. But still the smell persisted. It clung to every chair, every curtain, the perfume of decay, of punishment. And yet no one spoke of justice, because this was Spain, and he was El Rey, the man who had once ruled over the Inquisition, who had crushed liberal revolutions with blood and fire, who had restored absolute monarchy through terror. That man now lay sobbing like a child, begging a ceiling that would not answer, whispering the names of girls who had vanished into convents, of sisters who had vanished into tombs. Ferdinand had not merely sinned. He had reigned through sin, turned cruelty into ceremony, turned rape into diplomacy, turned the royal bed into an altar of blood. And now the crown was watching him die. Silently, without protest, without pity, because even kings, when they rot alone. From the corridor came a soft knocking, a servant, a message. The Queen Maria Cristina refused to come. She was 17. Already she had begun to sleep with guards. Already she plotted for her infant daughter's future. Ferdinand's daughter, his last hope, his final curse. He tried to sit up. Failed. Tried again. A stream of pus ran from his ear. His lips moved. No one will remember. But they would. Oh, they would. Not the treaties, not the wars, but the women, the screams, the red silk sheets that no longer gleamed but pulsed with damp history. They would remember the taste of his rain, iron, and salt and spoiled meat. They would remember the smell, and the mirror remained covered. Because even now, at the edge of death, Ferdinand VII feared only one thing: the truth of his own reflection, a truth that no priest could absolve, and no king could escape. He was born to a lie, and nursed on venom. Ferdinand was the son of Charles IV of Spain, a monarch too weak to rule and too cowardly to resist the manipulations of his infamous favorite Manuel Godoy. The court whispered, then roared, that Ferdinand was not the true heir, that Godoy, the queen's lover, was the boy's true father. The boy himself believed it. He saw the glances, heard the jokes. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, spat when she kissed him good night, and the nurses warned him never to repeat what he heard behind the velvet drapes. But Ferdinand was not stupid. He understood early that his body was a vessel not for dignity or love, but for royal appearances, bloodlines, and suspicion. The Spanish Bourbons had rotted from the inside out, their marriages little more than state contracts, their heirs born into palaces lined with rot. From childhood, Ferdinand lived among cripples, gout-ridden dukes, trembling archduchesses, and priests who smelled of sweat and semen. He played among relics of past grandeur, while courtiers poisoned each other with powders slipped into pomegranate seeds. He learned not to cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness in his world was prey. By the age of 10, Ferdinand could recite papal bulls from memory and detect arsenic in wine. By 13, he had seen his first dead mistress, a seamstress hanged in the palace garden after becoming pregnant with a nobleman's child. By 15, he no longer flinched when animals were flayed alive for amusement. His education was forged in silence and secrets. Tutors taught him the motions of morality, but never the heart. Priests spoke of obedience and chastity while fondling choir boys. And everywhere, portraits of his ancestors watched gaunt, powdered, skeletal men whose glory had died centuries before, but whose blood still ruled. His father, Charles IV, was absent in all ways but one rage. When he did appear, it was to slap, spit, or scream. Charles resented the boy who reminded him of betrayal, of gossip, of impotence. Once, in a fit of blind fury, he broke a porcelain figurine over Ferdinand's head, cutting the boy above the eye. The scar never healed cleanly. In adulthood, it twitched when he lied, which was often. But Ferdinand did not break. He watched and remembered. He learned early that survival was not for the kind, but the cunning. That love was bought, not given. That power lived in the shadows, in the spaces between confessions and coronations. By the time he turned 18, Ferdinand was a creature carved by court decay. He smiled when touched, bowed when insulted, and wrote letters dripping with affection to the very men who tried to strip him of inheritance. He became a mirror of the court sickness, a perfect reflection of its hypocrisy. In 1808, his first true betrayal was rewarded. Napoleon, seizing on Spain's weakness, forced both Charles IV and Ferdinand to abdicate in favor of his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. Ferdinand was exiled briefly but returned as a puppet king when the French collapsed. When he re-entered Madrid, crowds screamed for the desired one. They didn't know what they had summoned, because Ferdinand had returned not as a victim, but as an executioner. He immediately abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, arrested reformers, and began a campaign of purging anyone who had dared dream of a modern Spain. He unleashed the Holy Alliance's fury with the aid of French bayonets, not against enemies of the state, but against thinkers, writers, women. He hanged priests who had favored republics. He flayed journalists. He allowed bishops to excommunicate girls who had worn their hair down in public. His vengeance was not political. It was personal. He remembered the mockery of his youth, the snickers, the rumors of Godoy's seed. Now, he turned Spain into a kingdom of punishment. Every whispered insult he'd once endured, every backhanded compliment he now answered with blood. His laws had no logic, only pattern. The more he had once feared someone, the more violently he destroyed them. His first wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, lasted only 4 years. The daughter of Queen Maria Carolina and niece of Marie Antoinette. She had wit, grace, and political instinct. She also dared to speak. Within a year, she was vomiting daily. The palace physicians called it nerves. Court letters suggested poisoning. When she died in 1806, her skin was jaundiced and her hands blackened, signs the poor were hanged for. But queens were embalmed under. Ferdinand wept publicly, privately. He ordered her jewelry melted and her letters burned. It was the first time he tasted control over death. It would not be the last. His second marriage, to Maria Isabel of Portugal, was even shorter. She died giving birth to a girl. Ferdinand refused to see the child. He called her the little corpse. When the infant died weeks later, he didn't weep. He ordered new drapes. He had them made from Portuguese mourning lace. Ferdinand's grief was not human. It was decorative. His world was one of symbols, not souls. He collected mementos of his wives' suffering, a bloodied glove, a torn chemise. He locked them in a box beneath his writing desk and ordered his ministers never to speak of the women again. And then he married again and again, each younger than the last, each more frightened. The court said nothing, because Spain, after all, was still a monarchy, and Ferdinand, twisted, paranoid, indulgent, was its king. The rot that had once been rumor was now ritual, and the child who had once flinched at whispered mockery had become a man no one dared name aloud without fear of disappearing into the night. By the time Ferdinand VII entered his fourth decade, the Spanish monarchy had ceased to be a political institution and had become, instead, an instrument of his private compulsions. The court did not govern it, obeyed. The ministers did not debate, they watched. Every door in the palace creaked under the weight of secrets, and every chamber echoed with the muffled cries of obedience dressed as devotion. The Spanish Empire, already fractured by rebellion in the colonies, rotted from its core, and that core was a man ruled not by duty or faith, but by craving. His obsession was control, and control, for Ferdinand, was only real when it touched flesh. He no longer concealed his appetites. Why should he? He was the Rey Absoluto. God had placed him above the law, and he made a spectacle of reminding everyone. He summoned noble daughters to read to him late at night, girls no older than 12, cloaked in white, required to sit at his feet and whisper psalms. The priests condoned it. The mothers wept in silence. He forced them to kiss his feet and called it devotion. He had begun to blur the lines not just between sin and sanctity, but between ceremony and sadism. His wives, each a girl, each a prisoner, were given guards not for protection, but surveillance. Their letters were intercepted, their visitors screened, their rooms locked from the outside. Maria Josefa, his third wife, developed sores on her hands from nervously wringing them day and night. When she miscarried, Ferdinand ordered her doctors flogged for negligence and replaced them with a priest who whispered prayers in her ears as she bled. She died months later, pale, voiceless, and forgotten. Her funeral lasted 1 hour. That same evening, he attended a masked ball. The hypocrisy was not hidden, it was glorified. Ferdinand saw his power not as a burden, but a crucible for indulgence. He commissioned portraits of himself in elaborate mythological scenes: Hercules, Jupiter, Solomon surrounded by half-nude women posing as Spanish provinces. These paintings, hidden in the upper rooms of the royal palace, were never shown publicly. They were for his eyes only a personal theology of lust and sovereignty. One canvas depicted him with the head of Saint John the Baptist in his lap, a naked, blindfolded girl weeping at his feet. His signature was in the blood at the bottom. The church remained silent. Why would it not? He paid for new altars. He expanded monasteries. He gifted relics soaked in gold. In return, bishops turned away as he blackmailed nuns offering indulgences in exchange for confessions, then using those confessions to trap them in cycles of shame. One cloister near Toledo saw 6 young nuns transferred in a single year after complaints reached Rome. The Vatican replied with silence. Ferdinand sent a thank you gift, a ruby-encrusted chalice, and a letter of gratitude for spiritual discretion. He now kept a list. Names of girls, of priests, of court officials who had displeased him or amused him. Some were punished, others rewarded. the difference was arbitrary. Once, a young page boy spilled wine on his robe. The boy vanished. His mother hanged herself outside the palace gates days later. Ferdinand never asked about it, but he kept the blood-stained robe. Everything had become ritual. The royal physician was instructed to examine any noble girl who entered the palace not for health, but for virginity. A black ledger recorded the details: breasts undeveloped, hips narrow, voice pleasing. It read like a butcher's inventory. Ferdinand did not read the Bible anymore. He read the ledger, and he prayed. He prayed before each visit. He believed, or pretended to, that his acts were trials of loyalty, tests of faith, those who endured without complaint, he said, were blessed. Those who wept were weak. Those who resisted were witches. He had them exiled, beaten, or married off to soldiers stationed in the colonies, where most died of fever or childbirth before the year ended. Even his court began to fear sleep, because he prowled at night, barefoot, wearing only a robe, his syphilitic sores covered with powders and perfumes. Ferdinand wandered the halls with a lamp in one hand and a whip in the other. He checked doors. He entered rooms unannounced. Sometimes he stared. Sometimes he touched. Sometimes he asked for lullabies. Servants whispered that if you heard his steps after midnight, it was best to pretend you were dead. The royal palace, once a symbol of Spanish glory, had become a theater of humiliation. Even the architecture obeyed him. Mirrors were removed, curtains replaced with heavier cloth to muffle sound. The fountains were drained after he claimed the splashing voices mocked him. Statues were repositioned to avoid the king's gaze. The stone lions in the garden, once symbols of royal strength, had their eyes carved out on his order. He said they looked too judging. The empire crumbled in the distance. Colonies rebelled. Trade collapsed, but Ferdinand remained fixed on his rituals. When he heard that Peru had declared independence, he merely laughed and asked if the Peruvian ambassador's wife was as soft as rumored. When he lost Mexico, he wrote in his diary, "Let them go. Who needs rebels when I have virgins?" By now the disease had begun to fester in visible ways. His fingers twitched. His speech slurred. He forgot names. His jaw ached. But he insisted on attending royal processions. His face painted with white powder, his cheeks blotched beneath rouge. He looked more corpse than king. And still the people cheered out of fear, out of habit, out of centuries of obedience beaten into the soul of Spain. He married again, this time to a girl not yet 17, Maria Cristina of the Two Sicilies, pale, slender, docile. She walked like a ghost on her wedding day, her veil covering not innocence, but silence. She would be his final queen, but not his final victim. Because even as the rot began to boil in his bones, even as his mind unraveled and his body turned to ruin, Ferdinand clung to one last illusion that he ruled not just a nation, but the very flesh of those beneath him. And if he could not rule them in life, he would stain them in memory. Forever. They once said a noblewoman could not vanish in Spain. They were wrong. By the late 1820s, Ferdinand VII no longer contented himself with coercing the silent and poor. He had become emboldened by impunity, and the silence of the aristocracy was now a challenge. He no longer hunted only in the shadows of the palace. He began to stalk the high-born women of name, of lineage, of consequence, as if their titles were veils he wished to tear away, one by one, until all of Spain knelt before his hunger. It began with veiled invitations, an evening of poetry, a private recital, a royal commission for a portrait. The fathers could not refuse. To defy a royal summons was treason, no matter how unnatural the hour, no matter how terrified the girl. The Countess of Almodovar's daughter never returned from her third sitting. Her portrait, once commissioned by Ferdinand himself, was quietly destroyed. Her father was given a promotion. Her mother retired to a convent where she took no vows, spoke no words, and died within months. The court called it illness. Madrid called it suicide. It continued with the Marquis of Laredo's niece, 17, clever, devout. She was summoned to read scripture to the king, alone. She returned home days later with bruises she refused to explain. Her uncle tried to raise the matter before the royal council. 2 days later, he was arrested for improper conduct with his own niece and exiled to the Canary Islands. The girl was married off within a week to a man twice her age, with debts only the crown could forgive. Ferdinand had learned something vital. Power was not in silence, it was in forced complicity. The nobles began offering their own, not out of devotion, but fear. Daughters were raised to please the court. Obedience became currency. There were whispers of entire finishing schools created to train girls in royal etiquette, how to curtsy, how to hold eye contact, how to endure what must not be named. These girls were not poor. They were blue-blooded, multilingual, prepared for politics, and still, they were delivered like tributes to a throne that fed on purity. The palace guards no longer looked away. They opened the doors. Ferdinand's private rooms were now referred to in the murmurs of servants as La Capilla de la Carne, the chapel of flesh. Girls entered in white, left in silence, sometimes not at all. He documented everything. In ledgers bound in leather, he wrote notes in his own hand, cried too early, did not bleed, obedient but dull. They were scored with initials and numbers codes only he understood. Ministers who displeased him found their daughters summoned. Bishops who hesitated on edicts found their nieces called to the palace for tutoring. The line between Spain's nobility and Ferdinand's appetite dissolved until the court itself became his brothel. And still, no one acted, because Ferdinand understood the cost of outrage. He had learned that if you implicated enough people in your crimes, if you smeared every hand with filth, then no one would dare point fingers. The court became an accomplice by survival. Mothers coached their daughters. Fathers told them to be brave. And Spain, once a land of empire, of conquistadors and crusaders, now cowered before the whims of a single decaying man. But rot spreads, and it began to show. Ferdinand's body had become a monument to his own sins. His teeth loosened. His breath stank of copper and decay. The sores between his thighs wept openly. His weight fluctuated wildly bloated one week, skeletal the next. His eyes, once sharp and predatory, grew dull with fever, then flared again with unpredictable fury. At times, he mistook portraits for people, whispered apologies to tapestries, screamed at statues. Once, he ordered the flogging of a marble bust of Queen Isabella III, convinced she had cursed him. The court adjusted, always. They kept water basins at every turn. They replaced his linens twice a day. Perfume was sprayed ahead of his arrival. Ministers were warned not to stare too long, and always, the girl arrived. Each week, a new one. Always veiled, always silent. But the world beyond the palace was changing. Spain's colonies in the Americas had declared independence. The treasury bled silver like an open wound. Bands of liberals plotted in secret taverns. Newspapers, smuggled in from France and England, hinted at the king's excesses. Pamphlets appeared unsigned, written in Latin, and riddles naming noble families, hinting at scandal, warning of judgment. And then the incident. The Duchess of Bureda's daughter was taken. She was not veiled. She was not poor. She was not forgotten. She was 21, engaged to a French ambassador, and well educated. She refused the summons. Ferdinand insisted. The ambassador threatened to withdraw. The king relented publicly. But 3 weeks later, on her way to Mass, the girl vanished. The French embassy demanded answers. Ferdinand offered condolences, claimed she had fled with a lover, claimed she was mentally unstable. But rumors spread that she had been seen at the palace, pale and disoriented, her hair shorn, her hands shaking. A maid confirmed it, then disappeared. The ambassador left Spain in fury. Foreign papers printed stories of the Mad King of Madrid. Caricatures depicted him as a swollen toad in a crown, devouring maidens. The Vatican sent a polite inquiry. Ferdinand responded by arresting 3 priests for insubordination and doubling the funds for church renovations. But the tide had turned. Even the nobles began to murmur, not out of conscience but fear. Because if he could take the daughter of a duchess, what stopped him from taking anyone? Maria Cristina, his young 4th queen, began locking her chamber from the inside. She stopped attending dinners. She claimed illness, but servants reported her trembling in the mornings, her hair falling out in clumps, her voice barely audible. Once, she was found staring into a fire, whispering, "He's already dead. He just doesn't know it yet." And perhaps he didn't, because Ferdinand VII still believed himself untouchable, still believed that the throne sanctified by centuries, blessed by popes, bathed in gold would protect him from judgment. But judgment had begun to knock at the palace gates, not with swords, but with silence, with doors that no longer opened, with eyes that refused to meet his, and with the growing realization, even among the highborn, that their king was no longer a man. He was a sickness. And sickness, if left unburied, consumes the house it rules. By the spring of 1833, the decay was no longer spiritual, symbolic, or whispered behind brocade fans. It was physical, observable, a grotesque reality that saturated the velvet of every corridor, crept into every cushion, and curled beneath every carved cornice of the royal palace. Ferdinand VII was dying, and all of Madrid knew it not by proclamation, but by scent. The courtiers wore cloves in their lapels. Ministers smeared eucalyptus oil beneath their nostrils. Priests refused to enter his chamber unless the incense was thick enough to blind them. The royal physician V in 2 years no longer took notes. What was there left to diagnose? The king's flesh blistered at the joints. His breath frothed with blood. His eyes wept yellow. Even his voice, once booming, imperious, had degraded into a rasping wheeze, like wind dragging across a crypt door. Still, he ruled, or believed he did. He signed decrees with a trembling hand, often forgetting what they said minutes later. He issued orders that contradicted themselves. He knighted a ghost, a general who died 5 years earlier. When told of the mistake, he merely laughed and said, "Then let heaven recognize his rank." In the hallways, rumors moved faster than servants. Some said he'd begun conversing with his dead wives. Others claimed he barked like a dog at night, waking the palace with howls. A few even whispered that he kept a severed finger in a velvet box beside his bed, the last piece of his own body that had not yet betrayed him. But none dared speak openly, because he still breathed. And while he breathed, he could still summon, still touch, still punish, and most terrifying of all, still marry. Maria Cristina, his teenage queen, was now visibly pregnant. Her face, once ivory pale with youth, had yellowed with dread. Her belly swelled with the future, and the court watched with sick fascination as the young woman moved through the palace like a bride at her own funeral. She spoke little, slept less, and when she did sleep, she clutched a crucifix until her knuckles blanched. She knew what it meant to bear his heir, to carry the last hope of a dynasty that had rotted from root to crown. And Ferdinand, he clung to her, with hands that trembled, with a tongue blackened by ulcers. He kissed her belly while mumbling about redemption, about legacy, about a son who would purify the line. But Maria Cristina was carrying a girl. They all knew. The doctors had hinted it. The midwives had whispered it. And Ferdinand, in his delusion, called her Felipe, named her before she was born, dreamt of a boy with a crown of thorns who would restore the empire. But in the shadows, others whispered of what else she might carry. Not just a child, but a final witness? Because she had seen what no queen had lived to recount. She had watched him dissolve, had smelled the putrefaction between his thighs, had heard the muttered names at night girls long dead, women never named. She had felt his hands go slack in her hair as the fevers stole his breath, only to rise again like a corpse remembering desire. By summer, Ferdinand could no longer walk. His attendants, 2 monks and a mute valet, carried him in a padded chair wherever he insisted on going. He requested daily rides through the palace gardens, where he slumped in his seat like a grotesque puppet, his skin covered in veils to protect the sores. Peacocks fled at his scent. Flowers wilted near his passing. Once, A child who glimpsed him from a distance began to scream and refused to speak for 3 days. But worse than the sight was the sound. He muttered constantly to no one, to God, to ghosts, to wives, to unborn sons. He begged for mercy, then cursed the Virgin. He promised to build cathedrals, then ordered executions. Once, he demanded a full orchestra be assembled to play his funeral march while he still lived. They obeyed. He wept throughout, clutching a crucifix in one hand and a strip of torn linen rumored to be from Maria Josefa's last gown in the other. The musicians were never paid. In the final months, his body began to consume itself. His nose collapsed. His gums split. His fingers curled into claws. His tongue bled when he spoke. And yet still he summoned girls. Not to touch. Not even to speak. Just to sit. Silently. In his presence. While he stared at them as though trying to remember how it had once felt to be feared. They came. Always. Because their fathers willed it. Because the crown demanded it. Because Spain still bowed to the worm. And outside, beyond the gates, the people starved. The fields lay fallow. The soldiers deserted. The merchants traded in whispers and prayers. The colonies were gone. The empire was a corpse. And still, the palace danced minuets played over the groans of a dying man. Crystal chandeliers glittering above rooms soaked in lavender and rot. In late September, a physician tried to lance one of the ulcers on Ferdinand's thigh. He screamed so loudly, so inhumanly, that 3 servants fled the room and refused to return. The pus that poured from the wound was black and foul, and beneath it, bone was visible. The doctor collapsed and vomited onto the carpet. Ferdinand wept, not from pain, but from fear, because he had seen the bone beneath his skin, seen the skeleton waiting beneath his crown. He screamed again. No, not yet. I am the king. I am still the king. But no one responded. The doors were closed. The courtiers had begun to disappear, one by one, to the countryside, to France, to their ancestral homes. Ministers claimed illness. Priests found excuses. Even the palace dogs refused to enter his chambers. Only Maria Cristina remained, and even she had moved to another wing. They communicated through letters now. His rambling and stained. Hers, brief and dictated. The child in her belly kicked often, sometimes violently. She named it Isabel. The night before his death, Ferdinand asked to see himself. They brought a mirror. He stared, and what he saw was not a man, nor a king, nor a husband. He saw a ruin, eyes sunken like empty sockets, teeth scattered like tombstones, skin like melting wax, hair hanging in tufts, lips split open and trembling with fear. His breath rattled. His heart faltered. He tried to smile, tried to command, but only one sound came from his mouth, a long, low moan, not unlike the wind howling through the crypts beneath El Escorial. The mirror was taken away. He died just before dawn, alone, weeping, and the smell lingered for weeks. The bells of Madrid rang softly on September 29th, 1833. Not for triumph, not for mourning, but for relief. King Ferdinand VII, monarch of shame, emperor of filth, high priest of debauchery, was finally dead. No public announcement gave cause of death. No proclamation confessed to syphilis, madness, or moral collapse. The court simply whispered, "The king has passed," as though he had slipped peacefully into eternity instead of decaying, screaming, and choking on the rot of his own sins. His body was embalmed not out of reverence, but necessity. The rot had advanced too far. The flesh would not hold. It took 6 hours to prepare him. The mortician, trembling, made the sign of the cross 40 times before laying hands on the corpse. The stomach had to be drained, the face stitched, the fingers tied together to mask their curling. They packed the chest cavity with herbs, the mouth with cotton, and painted the lips red to mimic life. But no paint could mask the stench. It rose from him like incense from hell. He was dressed in regal white, draped in a gold-threaded cape, and crowned with the jeweled diadem once worn by Charles III. But nothing could disguise the fact that beneath the silks, he was meat, flesh that had failed, the cadaver of an empire. The coffin was closed quickly, and yet the spectacle continued. The funeral procession stretched for miles. Priests chanted psalms. Soldiers marched in solemn precision. The streets were lined with citizens not weeping, not mourning, but watching, like witnesses to the fall of a plague-ridden idol. There were no cheers, no cries, just the rustle of fabric, the clink of sabers, the heavy drag of wheels over cobblestone. They buried him in the pantheon of the kings, at El Escorial, that vast, silent necropolis where centuries of Spanish monarchs slept beneath marble slabs. But Ferdinand would not rest among them in peace. Even the stone that sealed his tomb bore no truth. It read only Ferdinandus VII, De gratia, Hispaniarum Rex, by the grace of God, as if God had not turned his face long ago. Maria Cristina did not attend the burial. She remained in the palace with her newborn daughter, Isabel. The child was healthy, unmarked, but the midwives reported how the mother stared at her for hours without speaking, her hands trembling, as though unsure whether she had given birth to salvation or to something cursed. The court moved quickly. Within days, officials declared Isabel as heir to the throne, launching the Carlist Wars that would rip Spain apart in decades of civil bloodshed. But no one spoke of Ferdinand. No one mentioned the box of ledgers, quietly burned in the palace furnace. No one referenced the locked chamber on the east wing, the one that smelled faintly of perfume and mildew, the one sealed with wax. Spain turned its eyes outward, to treaties, to rebellion, to inheritance. But the stain remained, a stain no court ritual could erase, no canonization of royal dignity could conceal, because those who had lived beneath his rule, those who had whispered prayers in his corridors, who had kissed his ring with trembling lips, who had watched their daughters enter the velvet darkness of his chambers, would never forget. They had tasted the reign of a man whose lust had drowned reason, whose reign fed not the spirit of the nation, but the appetite of a monster in royal clothes. And still, he was not punished. He was mourned by bishops, honored in state, buried beside kings who built cathedrals and conquered continents. History, the official one, inked his reign in neutral tones, a complex ruler, a man of conviction, a restorer of monarchy. But beneath the marble of El Escorial, the worms knew better. They chewed through silk, through parchment, through bone. They chewed without titles, without reverence. They ate what he had become, what he had always been. And Spain, for all its rituals and processions, could not silence the truth buried in the walls of its own palace that for nearly half a century, the crown had not been worn, but defiled. And though the king was dead, his shadow lingered, in silence, in shame, in the mirror-covered rooms that no one dared open again. The palace stands still now, its chambers dusted in silence and its chandeliers heavy with years. No laughter echoes from the balconies, no girls whisper behind fans, no scent of incense cloaks the corridors, only the faint trace of something older, older than kings, older than nations, the scent of history that refuses to rot away completely. In one forgotten wing, the windows remain shut, the tapestries have yellowed, and behind one sealed door, if one listens long enough, one might hear nothing at all, the purest form of condemnation. For what legacy survives a throne of worms? Not the crown, not the glory, only the silence, only the silence.